Somewhere on the Eastern Front, on the morning of February 15th, a Russian military commander picked up his radio and said something that will probably be studied in war colleges for the next 50 years. Not because it was brilliant, not because it revealed some previously unknown tactical insight, because it was the single most honest thing a Russian officer has said into a recording device since this war began, and he had no idea he was being recorded. Ukraine's Military Intelligence Directorate, known by its Ukrainian acronym HUR, intercepted the call and published it. The commander is screaming at his own soldiers. His men have refused to advance. They are sitting in whatever cover they've found, staring at the open ground between their position and the Ukrainian defensive line, and they are not moving. The commander's response to this, to soldiers telling him they will die if they walk forward, is not tactical reassessment. It is not a request for more information about what they're facing. It is a single, repeated command delivered at increasing volume. Move forward. And then, a sentence that tells you everything about the state of Russia's military in the fourth year of this war. Faster. I need to file the financing report. There it is. Not, we need this ground for tactical reasons. Not, reinforcements are coming. Just, I have a deadline. His soldiers' lives are a paperwork problem. Their deaths will become a line in a report that will travel up a chain of command to people who will nod and ask why the numbers aren't higher. This is not an isolated incident. This is Russia's military in February 2025, a force that has lost somewhere between 1.2 and 1.3 million soldiers to death, wounds, capture, and desertion, that is now conscripting reservists who were never supposed to see a front line, that is secretly mobilizing its population in a way it dare not announce publicly, and that is somehow still being ordered to advance every single day. This is the story of how an army destroys itself, and what happens to the country left behind when it does. Let's stay with that intercepted call for a moment, because there are two things happening in it simultaneously, and they point in completely different directions. The first thing is the refusal itself. Russian soldiers are saying no, not deserting, though that happens too, not surrendering, though that also happens. They are in the middle of an active military operation, looking at what they've been ordered to walk into, and collectively deciding that the order is not something they're willing to obey. In a military culture that punishes dissent with prison sentences and, in some documented cases, execution, the fact that this is happening openly enough to be captured on an intercepted radio call tells you something about how far Russian military cohesion has collapsed. To understand why they're refusing, you need to understand what they're being ordered to walk into. And that requires understanding what Ukraine has been quietly building on every approach to every town and city it intends to hold. Ukraine calls them kill zones. The name is accurate and unambiguous. These are not defensive positions in the traditional sense, a trench line or a fortified building that an attacker has to overcome. They are engineered environments designed to make movement across them as close to impossible as modern military technology can achieve, and to ensure that anything that does manage to move across them is immediately found, tracked, and destroyed. The outer layer is physical. Ukrainians call it plutonka, a Ukrainian term for the dense networks of thin barbed wire strung low across the ground, designed not to stop a soldier but to catch his boots and clothing, to tangle him, to slow him down until something else can deal with him. Behind the wire are massive concertina coils, chest-high barriers that have to be cut or climbed, both of which take time. Time is the one thing you cannot afford in a kill zone. Time is what gets you killed. For any Russian unit fortunate enough to have armored vehicles, and fewer of them do now than at any point since the war began, the ground itself is a weapon. Anti-tank mines, buried in patterns calibrated to defeat mine-clearing equipment. Tank ditches, trenches too wide for tracked vehicles to cross without bridging equipment that Russian assault units rarely carry. Dragon's teeth, rows of reinforced concrete pyramids that channel vehicles into predetermined corridors, where anti-tank teams and drones are waiting. And then there are the drones. This is where the kill zone concept has evolved beyond anything World War I or World War II defensive doctrine could have anticipated. Ukraine operates hundreds of FPV drones, first-person view aircraft with explosive warheads, piloted by operators watching video feeds from several kilometers away. These are not expensive precision weapons. A Ukrainian FPV drone costs somewhere between $400 and $800 to build. It carries enough explosive to destroy an armored vehicle or kill everyone in a 10-meter radius. And Ukraine produces them in quantities that have fundamentally changed what it means to cross open ground in this war. Reconnaissance drones identify the Russian soldiers the moment they leave their covered positions. The location is transmitted to FPV operators and artillery coordinators simultaneously. The FPV drones arrive within minutes. sometimes seconds. Artillery follows. What Ukraine has built is an automated killing system that requires Russian soldiers to cross open terrain, seated with physical obstacles while being tracked from above and engaged from multiple directions. The barbed wire that slows them down at the start of the crossing ensures they're still in the engagement zone when everything else arrives. This is what the soldiers on that intercepted radio call were refusing to enter, and their commander's response was to tell them that his report was due. To understand what Russia's insistence on attacking these kill zones is actually costing, look at Pokrovsk, a small industrial city in eastern Ukraine's Donetsk region that Russia's 2025 summer offensive designated as a primary objective. The campaign to take Pokrovsk was supposed to be the kind of breakthrough operation that demonstrated Russia's continued offensive capability. It was going to show that despite years of grinding attrition, the Russian military could still concentrate force, overwhelm a Ukrainian defensive line, and capture a strategically significant target. Pokrovsk sits on road and rail connections that would meaningfully improve Russia's logistics in the region. It was a real objective with real military value. It is still partially under Ukrainian control. More than 6 months of sustained offensive operations, constant pressure, constant reinforcement, constant assault after assault into Ukrainian defensive lines. And Russia has not taken Pokrovsk. What it has done is pay for every meter of ground it has captured with a price tag that should terrify anyone in Moscow who is capable of reading a budget. Colonel Volodymyr Polevy, who heads communications for Ukraine's 7th Rapid Response Corps, gave the specific numbers on February 7th. On the Pokrovsk axis alone, Russia is losing approximately 6,000 personnel per month. Not in the entire war. On one axis. In 1 month. That is the equivalent of 2 full-strength combat brigades, the kind of formation that takes months to train, equip, and deploy, being effectively destroyed every 30 days in front of one Ukrainian-held city. The loss ratio is 1 Ukrainian casualty for every 6 Russian casualties, but Polevy highlighted a number that makes even that devastating ratio look understated. For every 100 Russians killed, approximately 130 are wounded. That 1.3 wounded per killed ratio is what military planners call a logistics multiplier, because a dead soldier is removed from the problem. But a wounded soldier requires medical evacuation, surgical care, hospital beds, rehabilitation, and either return to duty or permanent discharge. Russia's medical system is now processing casualties at a rate that would strain any military on Earth. And Russia's military medical system was not designed for anything close to this volume. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has assessed Russia's current casualty rate at approximately 1,000 soldiers per day. At that rate, Russia will reach 1.3 million total casualties, killed, wounded, captured, and missing. Within roughly 6 weeks of this video, the number is almost too large to process, so consider it this way. Russia has lost the equivalent of the entire active duty military of the United Kingdom, twice, and it is still being ordered to advance. Military institutions don't collapse the way buildings do, all at once in a single, catastrophic moment. They collapse the way bridges do under excessive load, gradually, then suddenly with warning signs that were visible for years before the failure that everyone will later call unexpected. Russia's military has been under load that would have broken most armies within 18 months. What has kept it functional, in the loosest definition of that word, is a combination of coercion, financial incentives, and the sheer size of Russia's population and territory. But all 3 of those supports are now failing simultaneously. The coercion problem is visible in the intercepted radio calls, the documented mutinies, and the refusal incidents that are now common enough to have their own vocabulary in Russian military communications. Soldiers are saying no. When the penalty for saying no is punishment that might range from arrest to summary execution, and all of those outcomes are documented in this war, and soldiers are still saying no, the coercion mechanism has lost its deterrent power. The fear of the front line has exceeded fear of the consequences of refusing. The financial incentive problem is what the Kremlin calls its pay-to-play model. Russia has been offering signing bonuses for voluntary military service that are, by Russian standards, extraordinary. Amounts that represent years of ordinary salary paid upfront for agreeing to deploy to Ukraine. For the first 2 years of the war, this worked. The financial offer was compelling enough, and the war felt distant enough to people in Russia's interior regions that volunteers kept showing up. They are no longer showing up in sufficient numbers. The Institute for the Study of War reported in October that Russia's volunteer recruitment model was delivering dramatically diminished returns. The men who were willing to go for the money have mostly already gone. Many of them are dead. The ones who survived and came back have told their communities what it's actually like. And the communities have stopped sending their sons. Which brings us to the third and most critical support: Russia's prison population. At some point in 2022, the Kremlin made a calculation that would have seemed unthinkable in peacetime. It would offer Russia's convicted criminals, murderers, rapists, armed robbers, full pardons in exchange for frontline military service. The Wagner private military company pioneered this program, sending pardoned convicts into some of the most intense urban combat of the war. By January 2025, Russia had recruited approximately 180,000 convicts under various versions of this scheme. The program is running out of inmates. Russia's prisons are not infinite. The men who were willing to accept the pardon for service exchange have mostly already taken it. What's left in the cells is either the portion of the prison population that calculated the survival odds and decided prison was safer, which suggests a level of strategic reasoning that should make Russia's commanders uncomfortable, or individuals whose crimes were severe enough that even a wartime government hesitated to release them. Volunteers depleted, prison recruitment exhausted, coercion losing its effect, and Russia still needs 35,000 replacements every single month just to stay even. In February 2025, UK military analyst Hamish de Bretton-Gordon published an assessment in The Telegraph that described what his intelligence contacts had told him was happening inside Russia's military recruitment system. The assessment explained something that, once you understand it, reframes everything else about this war. Russia is conducting a secret mass mobilization, not the kind with patriotic speeches and public ceremony, not the kind where the president goes on television and explains why the sacrifices being asked of Russian families are necessary and justified. The quiet kind, the kind designed specifically to obscure how many men are being pulled from civilian life and sent to the front, because the number, if it became publicly known, would be a political catastrophe. Russia's traditional conscription system runs on a biannual cycle, 2 intakes per year, historically around 130,000 men each, producing a predictable and somewhat visible flow of young men into the military. What de Bretton-Gordon's sources describe is the replacement of that system with a rolling continuous draft, designed specifically so that no single intake is large enough to be newsworthy, but the cumulative total across the year dwarfs anything Russia has officially announced. This is, de Bretton-Gordon assesses, already larger than the partial mobilization Putin announced in September 2022, the one that triggered a mass exodus of military-age men from Russia so large that the price of one-way flights out of the country spiked to 10 times normal within hours of the announcement. Roughly 700,000 Russians left the country in the months following that 2022 mobilization. Some estimates put the number higher. Putin learned something from that experience. Public mobilization announcements cause visible, politically damaging responses. So this time, there is no announcement. The rolling draft system pulls men in quietly. Reservists who were told they would only ever serve in rear areas and infrastructure protection roles, who signed contracts with explicit terms about frontline deployment, who are now being told that the terms have changed and they will be going to Ukraine. This is where the intercepted call gains a new layer of meaning. When the Russian commander's soldiers refused to advance, he called them refusers, as if it were the worst insult imaginable. But some of those soldiers may not be combat volunteers who changed their minds. They may be reservists who agreed to a specific type of military service and are now being ordered into frontline assault operations that were never part of their contract. Their refusal isn't cowardice. It's a response to a broken agreement. The Kremlin cannot publicly acknowledge this because acknowledging it would require explaining why the agreement was broken, which would require explaining that Russia is running out of people willing to fight voluntarily, which would require admitting that the war is not going the way that 4 years of official communications have insisted it is going. The pressure that runs from the Kremlin down through Russia's military command structure does not simply result in soldiers being ordered forward into kill zones. It also produces something darker. A culture of corruption and brutality within the officer corps that the Russian public is only beginning to learn about through the petitions and social media posts of soldiers' families. In October 2024, the Moscow Times published an investigation revealing that at least 100 Russian officers have executed their own subordinates in Ukraine. Not in combat, not as a consequence of firefights or accidents. Deliberately, as punishment for refusal, for insubordination, for failing to advance. Officers killing the soldiers under their command because the pressure from above demands results, and a soldier who refuses to produce results is, in the logic of this system, a problem to be eliminated rather than a human being to be led. The financial corruption runs alongside the physical violence. Multiple accounts describe Russian officers demanding that soldiers hand over their bank cards and PIN numbers, ostensibly to facilitate payment delivery to families back home in the event of the soldier's death. The actual purpose, in documented cases, is straightforward theft. Russia offers significant financial bonuses for frontline service, amounts that can reach several million rubles for combat deployment. An officer with a dead soldier's bank card and PIN number has access to that money. The soldier is not alive to object. The family, who may be told only that their relative died in combat, may never know the payment existed. This is what happens when an institution's culture is organized entirely around pressure and fear. The corruption flows in the same direction as the coercion, downward. Every officer who steals from a dead soldier learned that behavior in a system that taught him the only thing that matters is what your superiors think of you, and that the men under your command are a resource to be consumed, rather than a responsibility to be honored. The New York Times reported in December that Russia's military has developed what it described as an insatiable demand for men, a phrase that deserves to be understood literally. The machine Putin built requires a constant input of human beings to function. When it runs short, it sends the gravely ill and the recently wounded back to the front. When it runs shorter still, it reaches into the prisons. When the prisons run low, it reaches into the reserve pool. The machine does not ask whether the people it consumes are prepared or willing or capable. It asks only whether they are present. Here is where the story stops being about a war and becomes about something larger and more permanent. Russia had a demographic problem before February 2022. Its birth rate, 1.4 children per woman, was already well below the 2.1 replacement level needed to maintain a stable population. The country was aging. Its working-age population was shrinking relative to the total. These were known problems discussed in Russian government planning documents, worrying but manageable on a timeline of decades. The war compressed that timeline dramatically. Of the 1.2 to 1.3 million Russian casualties counted so far, the overwhelming majority are men between the ages of 18 and 45. Precisely the demographic cohort that drives economic productivity, that fathers children, that fills the workforce. Analyst Ihor Petrenko has calculated that the casualties already represent at least 2% of Russia's entire workforce. That figure sounds modest until you consider that economic systems are not linear. Losing 2% of your workforce in the specific demographic segment that holds the most specialized skills, fills the most physically demanding jobs, and contributes disproportionately to both GDP and birth rates produces consequences far larger than 2% of anything. Russia's labor shortage has already reached 2.3 million people, according to RBC Ukraine. Not projected. Current. The gap between the workers Russia has and the workers its economy needs to function is 2.3 million, and it is widening every month that the war continues, and the secret mobilization pulls more men off factory floors, out of construction sites, away from farms and logistics networks, and into uniforms. The industries that are not directly feeding the war effort are hollowing out. Russia's construction sector, its agricultural supply chain, and its civilian manufacturing base, all are operating with dramatic labor deficits that cannot be filled from within the country's available population. Putin has responded by creating a war economy that prioritizes weapons production above all else, which means that the factories still running at full capacity are producing artillery shells and armored vehicles, while the rest of the civilian economy contracts. A war economy is not a sustainable economy. It is a temporary redirection of national resources toward military output, paid for by the gradual impoverishment of every sector not directly linked to the war. The Soviet Union ran a war economy for decades during the Cold War, and the costs, in living standards, in technological development, in infrastructure, were enormous even without a shooting war-consuming men, at the rate Russia is currently losing them. Russia is now importing labor to fill the gap. In 2021, the year before the invasion, approximately 5,000 Indian citizens received Russian work visas. In 2025, that number was approximately 72,000. Russia is also actively recruiting workers from Sri Lanka, from Central Asian republics, from anywhere that will supply bodies to fill the positions vacated by men who went to Ukraine and either died there or came back too damaged to work. The country is, in a demographic and economic sense, replacing its own population with temporary foreign labor while its men die in a foreign country. This is not a recoverable situation on a short timeline. Demographics do not bounce back quickly. The men who have died will not be replaced by the next generation for 20 years minimum. And that is assuming Russia's birth rate recovers, which it will not do while the war continues and while the economic conditions that drive family formation remain distorted by wartime priorities. Russia is looking at a generation-long demographic wound, inflicted entirely by a decision made by one man in February 2022. Former HUR Director Kyrylo Budanov, now head of the Office of the President of Ukraine, offered an assessment in September that cuts to the core of Russia's political dilemma. The question he was addressing was whether Russia's public, if it found out about the scale of the secret mobilization, would rebel. His answer was carefully considered and ultimately bleak. No, they won't rebel. Not because they support the war. Russian public opinion on the war is to the extent it can be measured in a country that imprisons people for saying the word war instead of special military operation. Deeply complicated and almost certainly more negative than official figures suggest. They won't rebel because the Russian state has spent decades building a coercive apparatus specifically designed to prevent the kind of organized public opposition that leads to rebellion. Protests are suppressed. Opposition leaders are imprisoned or poisoned. Independent media has been eliminated. The infrastructure of public resistance has been systematically dismantled. But Budanov's point is subtler than Russia won't revolt. His point is that Putin's real problem isn't political instability, it's the social contract. For the war to be politically sustainable, it needed to remain distant. The special military operation framing worked in the early period because it implied a limited professional military action that would not require the Russian public to sacrifice anything beyond what they were already accustomed to sacrificing. The men going to Ukraine were volunteers, the Kremlin insisted. The outcome would be swift. Normal life would continue. The secret mobilization is the moment that framing dies. When the reservist who was told he would never see a front line gets his deployment orders, the war stops being distant. When the factory worker who thought the defense contracts meant job security gets a draft notice, the war stops being someone else's problem. When the family that survived the 2022 mobilization by sending their son to serve in a logistics role discovers that the definition of logistics has been quietly expanded to include frontline assault, the war arrives at the kitchen table. This is the Pandora's box that the Atlantic Council describes Russia having opened. Mobilization, once it reaches beyond willing volunteers and desperate convicts into the general population, cannot be quietly closed again. The families that are affected know. They talk to other families. The network of people who have a direct personal stake in the war's continuation and who do not want it to continue grows with every draft notice issued. Over 1,500 Russian citizens have already signed a public petition accusing the military of concealing wrongdoing in the ranks. That petition was signed despite the legal risks of public opposition in Putin's Russia. It will not be the last. Putin is caught between two catastrophic options. Stop the pressure, reduce the daily assault rate, pull back from impossible. Objectives like Pokrovsk accept a defensive posture that would let Russia consolidate its gains and stop hemorrhaging men. And admit implicitly that 4 years of war have produced a military that cannot advance. Or maintain the pressure, keep feeding men into the kill zones at the rate of 1,000 per day, continue the secret mobilization, and watch Russia's demographic and economic foundations erode beneath the weight of a war that is consuming the country faster than it is consuming Ukraine. He is choosing to maintain the pressure every day. There is a scenario somewhere in the range of the theoretically possible in which Russia wins this war, in which Ukraine's resistance eventually exhausts itself, in which Western support fractures, in which Russia's pressure, maintained at enormous cost, finally produces the territorial outcome that Putin has demanded. Let us take that scenario seriously for a moment, because it is the scenario that justifies everything Russia is currently doing. In that scenario, Russia wins. What does it win? It wins territory that will require decades of investment to rebuild, in a country whose population has been devastated by war and occupation, and will not be friendly to Russian rule. It wins the status of a country that successfully invaded a neighbor, a status that has already produced the most severe Western sanctions in modern history, and will not be lifted by a Russian military victory. It wins an economy that has been restructured around weapons production, and will need to be rebuilt from scratch when the weapons are no longer needed. And it wins a demographic crisis that will take a generation to even begin to address. A country with a 2.3 million labor gap, a birth rate 33% below replacement level, and the knowledge that the men who should be raising the next generation of Russians are buried somewhere in eastern Ukraine. This is what the commander on that intercepted radio call is fighting for. This is what he is demanding his soldiers die for. Not Russia's future. Russia's future is being consumed by this war faster than any military victory could compensate for. He is fighting for a report, a line in a document that will travel up through a command structure to a man in Moscow who will read it and ask why the numbers aren't higher. The soldiers who said no on February 15th understood something their commander did not. They were not refusing to fight for Russia. They were refusing to die for nothing. And in the fourth year of a war that has cost Russia more than 1 million men, without producing the swift victory that justified the cost, nothing is an increasingly accurate description of what's on offer. The machine keeps running, the reports keep being filed, the men keep going forward, and Russia keeps getting smaller.